Alabama, 52. Texas A&M, 23. Remember when we talked last week and we predicted this game? To me, this is always one of the easier games in the conference to predict, and yet it's so misleading because it makes you think by that tone in my voice that A&M's just, they just got a terrible roster. You can run all over them. They don't. They got a top 10 roster. In fact, maybe more lofty than that. But they're so limited in what they're capable of because of a number of things we're about to get into. So I don't think there was any chance this game was going to end any other way than what it did. 52-24 is the final. I guess if there's one small thing, if I go back and look at what we thought, a projected final score may be, I'd shave about 10 points off of each team. We thought somewhere in the 41 to 13 or 14 range. But as it stands, Alabama could have scored forever if they wanted to. Look at these. Oh, sick. All right, let's get into this. If you're listening on the podcast, this means nothing to you. We're watching footage of the game. So I want to reiterate something here before I dive into this. We discuss Alabama differently on this show. It is boring, or should be boring for everyone, if we just sit here and tell you how great they are. So let me get that out of the way. They're great. We probably have them rated as the number one team in the country right now. They're splitting hairs right now with what they've done and Clemson's done and what we think Ohio State will do. So anyway, they're one of the very best teams in the country. So it's a waste of time to just talk about how great they are. So what we do is we raise the standard significantly when we talk about these great teams on this show. It sounds like we're being pessimist, but we're not. We're just getting the boring stuff out of the way, the same old cliched stuff everyone says. We really pick these teams apart. And we pick them apart at a higher degree than we pick apart teams that are just ranked 13th in the country. So, quick accolades. Mac Jones, excellent game yesterday. Mac Jones, I think you can make a solid argument, is the second best quarterback that Nick Saban has had at Alabama, behind Tua Tagovailoa. And that includes Jalen Hurts. I think that Mac Jones gives them a different dynamic and a different element and a better ability to take advantage of the plethora still of talent at wide receiver that they have than Jalen Hurts did. Pause for a second. Do you understand what I just said? They lost Jerry Jeudy to the NFL draft, Henry Ruggs to the NFL draft, and Tua Tagovailoa. Those are three generational type talents that they lost for a program at one time to the draft. Did you watch them yesterday? If I could have pixelated the receivers and the quarterback to where you couldn't tell who they are, it would have looked no different. How thorough a machine of a program do you have to be? Okay, so you see why that's boring? Because everyone says that about Alabama. Okay, so we got the praise out of the way. John Mechie emerging as a wide receiver. He was probably ready last year, and they were just so loaded you didn't know about him. From Canada, by the way, which is what Colin, have I not always said the key to Alabama winning another title is they got to recruit Canada better? So they are. So John Mechie looks good now. Malachi Moore, true freshman, doesn't matter. Told you about him in the preseason. He's shining. They got another true freshman behind him, and Brian Branch, who I wouldn't be shocked to see taking some reps at safety down the road. A little cross-training maybe, some missed tackles, some blown assignments here or there. A lot of competition in that Alabama secondary. So those things are out of the way. Let me tell you a couple of things that are dangerous for Alabama. Certainly not yesterday, but let me tell you a few things that may be dangerous down the road. Sometimes I've noticed people have the tendency to watch these performances like the one Alabama had yesterday where they score half 100 on a really good team. And they think, okay, well, we have better teams coming up. We know we're going to play Georgia, for example, in a couple of weeks. But that's okay, even though they're good defensively, because here's what your mind tells you. Your mind tells you, well, if we scored 52 on A&M, certainly we'll be able to score at least, 31 or 35. So, let's shave 30 or 40% of our production off. We'll still be fine. That's not the way this sport works if you're heavily dependent on one facet of your game. To give you an extreme example of that, did you notice the difference yesterday in Mississippi State versus week one Mississippi State? Alabama is certainly not Mississippi State, but I'm giving you in principle the theory that I'm offering here. But you have to play someone who meets what I've always called the freeze point. A&M doesn't meet the freeze point, and that's why Alabama just ran up and down the field like it was a track meet on him yesterday and could have continued to do it as long as they want to. Think about this. That roster for A&M is not far away from Alabama's. And what I mean by that is Alabama is decidedly better. But the gap is not to the degree that they make it look. But the problem is A&M doesn't meet the freeze point. The freeze point is if you take a few cups of water, okay, and I put them in controlled environments. One of the environments is 26 degrees, one of them is 29 degrees. What's going to happen to the cups of water? They're both going to freeze. The one in the 26-degree setting, it'll freeze a little bit quicker, but they're both going to freeze, right? What is the gap there? 3 degrees difference? But now think about this. If I put one in 31-degree conditions and another one in 33-degree conditions, smaller gap, only a 2-degree gap, but the one in the 31-degree condition is going to freeze. The one in the 33-degree condition could sit there until the end of time, and it's going to be just as liquefied in 1,000 years as it is right now. Why is that? Well, there's this little threshold at 32 degrees that's pretty important. It's called the freezing point. And if you're above the freezing point, it doesn't matter. The freezing point, as it pertains to college football, is if you don't have a certain level of disruptive ability in your defensive front or cover ability on the back end, it doesn't matter how talented the rest of your roster is. So you got to meet a certain threshold, what I call the freeze point, against a team like Alabama, or they'll just dissect you. But here's what can happen. Alabama was very subpar running the ball yesterday, so they were totally dependent on explosive plays. And so they rack up 52 points through explosive plays, and you watch it and you just assume it's going to be there forever. What happens when you play a team that hits that freeze point? You got one coming up in 2 weeks. I can assure you, the Georgia Bulldogs meet the freeze point. So, a Vegas odds maker may tell you, oh, you know, the best safety in college football is only worth about 2 points. The best corner in college football, 2 points, maybe 2.5 points in an extreme example. You say, okay, well, let's just shave 4 or 5 points off of 52. What does that get us? We're still scoring in the upper 40s. Because what happens is, all of a sudden, all those streaks and go routes and in and ups that you saw, Alabama just break free on that secondary. What if instead of a 75-yard touchdown, it's incomplete, it's 2nd and 10? Do you know how big a difference that is? Just one of those plays. You know how big a difference that is? What if that happens to you just 2 or 3 times? How do you know the value of playing a team with a few more players in the secondary that meets the freeze point, is my question. You don't. But what I can tell you is if you don't fix that running game, and they will start working on it in earnest this week, if they don't balance out, and balancing may mean scoring a few less points, but if they don't balance out, just like I'm talking about with Georgia, there's going to come a time this year where all of a sudden they try and lean on that explosive play, and it's not there. And you don't have the threat of mobility at quarterback to bail you out either. So there's no excuse why Alabama can't run the ball at a very high level. They got the offensive linemen. All of them are going to play in the NFL. They got the running backs. A lot of them are going to play in the NFL. No excuse why they can't. They better get it fixed before they play someone who meets the freeze point in that secondary. Now, as for A&M, kind of saw who they were. I mean, it's the same thing every year, and it feels like it will be. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. The gap looks so big between A&M and these teams like Clemson when they played them last year, when they play Alabama. I'm trying to tell you, and people don't believe this, I guess, for obvious reasons. The gap is not that wide, guys. The gap is wide at 1 or 2 places. If I could take you to one of these games, and I could take you down on the field with me, and you could just watch Texas A&M get off a bus, if you could watch them warm up, if you could stand 5 feet away from their offensive linemen or their linebackers, they are massive. They are a huge team. They're so physically impressive. They look just like Clemson. They look just like Alabama. What that means is nothing when the game starts. But what I'm trying to tell you is they're not badly out-athleted like you think they are. They're just a couple of places where they are so deficient relative to the elites, quarterback being one of them, and I would argue offensive system in general being another one, that it makes the gap look insurmountable. It looks like there's a Grand Canyon, when in reality, it's like a creek, but then at 1 or 2 very important parts of your team, it's a Grand Canyon, which is what makes Nick Saban so impressive before I move on here. Think about the difference between Nick Saban and Jimbo Fisher. Nick Saban was at the very height of the best dynasty in the history of this sport in all likelihood. He was number 1 or number 1A, and that's the altitude he and Alabama have cruised at. And he was right in the middle of that run, and he hit the reset button. They didn't have this huge failure of a season. He hit the reset button. Around 2014, he realized we got to change offensively. What? So he's number 1, and then they change everything, which no one ever does. You normally have to fail before people say, all right, well, we got to change everything. Nick Saban's on top, and he says, you know what? I think I'll just remake my program entirely. And now, today, They're a better version of Oklahoma than Oklahoma's ever been. When you watch how thoroughly they dismantle people. And so, what's the difference between he and Jimbo Fisher? Nick Saban was number one and chose to change everything. Jimbo Fisher was number one at one time in 2013 and chose to put roots down. And nothing has changed since then about Jimbo Fisher. Nothing has changed about his offense because he figured, I've arrived. It's obvious I figured it out. This will work now. It'll work forever. And that's not the way sport works. That's not the way any sport works, much less this sport. So I know a lot of you yesterday and this morning, a lot of you are saying, $75 million? Man, we should be getting so much more than this for $75 million. I don't care if you pay him $75 billion. An increase in salary does not guarantee an increase in production. If Colin is making $750 an hour over here, and all of a sudden I put him in charge of A&M and I pay him $100 million, am I going to get mad at Colin when all of a sudden they're not winning national titles? No, Colin's never done that before. Why would I expect him to do it now? Just because I put more money in his lap, I should be more mad at the mirror than I should be at Colin. So Jimbo Fisher's won a national title before, but the point is, Jimbo's doing it the exact same way he's always done it. It's just his way doesn't work anymore, at least against the elite teams. They'll win 80% of their games, 75, 80% of their games, but you're mad because you're paying top dollar, you want top dollar results. Don't be mad at the dude for doing exactly what he's always done. Be mad at yourself because you just had a lot of money, so you decided to throw it at him. That's my only takeaway from Jimbo Fisher.